Joshua, why didn't I choose you? Michelle met his eyes in the rearview mirror and spoke the question that turned his whole world over. He had prepared for silence, the only thing people carry out of a divorce courtroom. Instead, she walked out wearing the smile of a woman, just handed back her freedom. A smile he had never once seen in 3 years of standing beside her. The light turned green. He didn't touch the gas. 3 years of keeping exactly the distance an assistant keeps. Her question had just erased all of it. He didn't answer her. Not at the light, not for the first mile. And by then, the silence had hardened into something neither of them could break without effort. Michelle didn't press him. She sat behind him with her hands folded on the leather folder her attorney had handed over on the courthouse steps, watching the city slide past the window, and Joshua kept both hands on the wheel and drove her home the way he had driven her home 400 times before. That was the part nobody understood about the job. It wasn't the calendar, or the flights, or the standing 8 o'clock briefing. It was the fact that he knew exactly how long to leave a silence alone, and she knew he knew, and neither of them ever said so. 3 years had built a language out of things they refused to say. One question in a rearview mirror had just put a crack straight through the middle of it. At a red light on Wabash, he opened the Notes app on the dash mount out of pure habit and logged the time they'd left the courthouse. 3:51. He had been doing it so long that his thumb moved before his mind did. Every pickup, every drop-off, every building he entered and left, and at the end of every month, a request to building services for an export of his own badge history, filed away where he could find it. Michelle had teased him about it in the first year and asked whether he took notes on his own dreams too. He'd told her it was efficiency, which was true enough to end the conversation. The real reason had a courtroom in it, one much smaller and uglier than the one they'd just walked out of, and a woman named Rachel, who stood up 4.5 years ago and said calmly under oath that Joshua Bennett was never home. He remembered the specific horror of that moment, not the accusation, but the discovery that he had no way to disprove it. He had been home almost every night, and he could not produce one single piece of paper that said so. He won. Anyway, barely. 9 days later, Rachel signed away her rights and left the state, and Lily had been 18 months old and asleep in the car seat when it happened. He'd started writing everything down that week and never stopped. He told the office it was because a good assistant doesn't remember with his memory. He told himself it was because a man should never again have to argue for his own life with nothing in his hands. Lily was 6 now, and his entire existence had narrowed to a set of fixed points around her. Up at 5:15, dinner at 6. 2 books, never 3, unless the second one was short. Every decision he made passed through one question before it reached him: does this touch my daughter? And the answer had for 3 years kept him precisely one polite step behind Michelle Voss at all times. Michelle knew about Lily. She asked the way careful people ask never too often. Last October, she'd sent a birthday package to his apartment, a set of watercolor pencils, and a card she'd written herself. And Lily had gone around for a week, telling the neighbors that her father's boss had beautiful handwriting. Joshua had put the card in a drawer and hadn't looked at it since. Some things were safer unexamined. He pulled up in front of her building on Delaware and put the car in park, and neither of them moved. Then Michelle leaned forward close enough that he could see her clearly instead of just the shape of her. "You're not going to say anything at all," she said. There was no accusation in it. She sounded almost curious the way she sounded in negotiations, when someone did something she hadn't predicted. Joshua looked at the steering wheel and counted the ways he could answer, and how many of them would still let him show up to work on Monday. "I think you had a very long day," he said, "and I think tomorrow it might look different to you." "That's what I thought you'd say." She gathered the folder against her chest. "It won't look different, but I'll let you have that." She went inside without looking back. Joshua sat at the curb for a full minute before he drove away. He could name the exact moment he'd stopped being able to see her as only his employer, and it had nothing to do with anything romantic. Singapore 2 years ago, a deal that had gone sideways at 2 a.m. local time. He'd found her sitting on the floor of a hotel corridor with her shoes off because her room key had demagnetized and she hadn't wanted to go down to the desk and be seen crying. He'd gotten her a new key. He'd gotten her tea she didn't drink, and he'd sat down on the carpet across from her and said nothing at all for 20 minutes, and the next morning at 8, she walked into a room and closed a 9-figure deal like the corridor had never happened. She'd never mentioned it. Neither had he. But something in his life had shifted that night, and he'd spent every day since making sure it never showed. What he did not know. Driving home to collect Lily from Nora Callahan's apartment down the hall was what had actually happened inside that courtroom. Daniel Reeves' attorney was a man named Martin Rusk, and Rusk had built the entire morning around a single document. Not a narrative, not an argument. A schedule, printed and bound 41 dates drawn from the most recent 3 years. Because as he told the court, that was the pattern at its worst. He read from it in the flat voice of a man reciting inventory. The purpose was to establish abandonment. That Michelle Voss had chosen her company over her marriage, systematically provably, and that the record of her own calendar would say it better than any witness. So Rusk read the calendar. He read the night she'd missed their anniversary dinner because a supplier called Brennan Mills had gone into receivership. He read the 4 canceled vacations. He read the emergency flight to Singapore 2 years ago, and the 72 hours she'd spent there, and the fact that she had not called home once. Michelle sat through it with her hands flat on the table and did not defend a single item because every item was true. Then, somewhere around the 4th page, something turned over in her chest. Rusk was reading the Brennan Mills, night 9:40 at night. A conference room. A decision that saved 200 jobs. And Michelle realized she could remember the room. There had been a plate of food on the table that nobody had ordered, and it had still been warm at midnight, which meant someone had gone out and gotten it and come back. She listened differently after that. The canceled vacation in the spring, a phone call at 5 a.m, and a set of rebooked flights already in her inbox before she'd asked for them. Singapore, a hotel corridor, and a man who sat on the floor and did not ask her a single question. Every date Martin Rusk read aloud to prove she had abandoned her husband was a date on which one specific person had been standing about 4 feet away from her. And Rusk didn't know it, and Daniel didn't know it, and it had taken a document designed to destroy her to make her see it. She had spent 11 years married to a man who kept a list of everything she failed to give him, and for 3 of those years, there had been someone else in the room giving without ever once producing a list. What unsettled her most was how little effort it had taken to overlook. Joshua had never made a single one of those nights visible to her. He had never said I stayed. Never let a favor land somewhere. She'd feel it. Never once used the word sacrifice about anything he'd done. She had accepted 3 years of it, the way a person accepts warm air in a building as a property of the room, rather than the work of somebody in the basement. Rusk kept reading, and Michelle sat very still, and somewhere between page 4 and page 5. She stopped feeling accused and started feeling something closer to ashamed. The judge granted the dissolution at 3:30. Michelle walked out at 3:45, feeling something she hadn't expected, which was relief. And under the relief, something much sharper. She found Joshua's car waiting in the parking lane on Ontario Street, with the engine running and the heat already on. Because of course it was. And she got in and asked him the only question that mattered before she could talk herself out of it. That evening, Joshua made pasta because it was Thursday, and Thursday was pasta, and Lily narrated a complicated dispute involving a girl named Bryn and the ownership of a particular purple marker. He listened, asked the right follow-up questions, and thought about a rearview mirror. "Dad," Lily had stopped talking about the marker. "You're not listening with your face." "I'm listening with my ears. The face is doing something else." "What's it doing?" "Math," he said. And she accepted this. Because to a 6-year-old, adults are always doing some invisible calculation, and it's never worth investigating. She talked through the rest of dinner about a class project involving the life cycle of a frog and about whether Nora's apartment smelled like soup on purpose, and Joshua answered all of it correctly, while a second track ran underneath. 2 books at bedtime, the short 1 second. Teeth. The hallway light left on at the angle she liked. It took 40 minutes, and he could have done it asleep, and he was aware the entire time that this was the thing. This exact, unremarkable sequence that he had spent 4.5 years making unbreakable. It was just after 10, and he'd closed her door when his phone lit up. "Michelle." He almost didn't answer, then did, and heard something in her voice he had heard exactly once before on a hotel corridor floor. "Are you alone?" "Lily's asleep." "What happened?" "Check your messages, not mine. Any of them." He put her on speaker and opened his texts, and there it was, from a number he didn't recognize. A photograph of the inside of his own car, taken, he assumed, from the sidewalk across Ontario Street. Michelle leaning forward between the seats, his face in the mirror. Underneath it, 4 words. 11 years. Nice work. His first reaction wasn't fear. It was a cold clarity, the same one he'd felt in a custody hearing with nothing in his hands. "He's had someone on us," Joshua said. "Not us." Michelle's voice was steady in a way that told him it was costing her something. "Me. It's me he's watching, Joshua. You're just in the frame, which is worse for you, not better." Then, after a moment, "There's another thing. Evelyn just called me." Evelyn Pierce was Michelle's attorney, and she did not call anyone at 10 at night with good news. Joshua sat down on the arm of the couch. "In the settlement," Michelle said. "Daniel refused a cash distribution 3 separate times. Evelyn thought he was being difficult about valuation. He wasn't. He took equity instead. 12% of Voss Group signed and executed this afternoon." Joshua understood the shape of it before she finished, and it was worse than anything the photograph implied. Daniel Reeve had not lost his marriage today. He had converted it. He'd walked out of that courthouse holding a seat inside the only thing Michelle had ever loved more than him, and a 12% shareholder was not an angry ex-husband sending pictures at night. A 12% shareholder could put a letter in front of the board of directors and require them to open it. "He can file a complaint," Joshua said. "He can require them to hear one, against me for conduct, against you for being the conduct." Michelle exhaled. He didn't want the money. He wanted standing. Joshua walked to Lily's door, or left open, 2 inches the way she liked, and looked at the strip of dark room and the shape of his daughter under the blanket, and did the arithmetic he'd been doing since a parking lot outside a family court building. If this went to the board, it went to the papers. If it went to the papers, his name went with it, and a name in a story like that does not come back clean. He wouldn't just lose the salary. He'd lose the health plan that covered Lily's inhalers, and the school he'd spent 2 years getting her into, and the specific, quiet, ordinary life he had built for her out of nothing but a schedule and a promise. "Joshua," Michelle's voice came small through the phone. Say something. I thought about the smile she'd walked out of that courthouse with, and how long it had probably been since anyone had seen it. I need to think, he said, about Lily. I know. She didn't argue, and that was the thing that undid him slightly. That's the right thing to think about. That's not what I meant. It's what you meant, Michelle said. You just don't want it to be. After she hung up, he stood in the hallway a long time. Then he went to the kitchen table, opened his laptop, out of the same reflex that had made him log the time at a red light on Wabash, and started a new folder. He named it with the date. He didn't yet know what he'd put in it. Downstairs, a car he didn't recognize sat across from the building with its lights off, and it stayed there until almost midnight. The letter arrived Monday at 9:10, and by 10:30, everyone on the executive floor knew what was in it. Diane Foster from Human Resources came down herself, which told Joshua everything before she opened her mouth. She sat across from him in the small conference room with a single page and explained that a shareholder holding 12% had submitted a formal complaint alleging an improper relationship between the chief executive and a direct subordinate that the board was required to convene, and that they'd set the hearing for Friday morning. You're suspended pending review, Diane said. Effective now, unpaid, because the complaint alleges conduct rather than performance, and that's the policy. I didn't write it. Joshua asked about the health plan. He asked it in the same voice he used to confirm a car service, and Diane looked at the page instead of at him. Coverage continues through the end of the month. If the review closes in your favor before then, nothing lapses. If it doesn't. She let that sit. There's also the quarterly bonus, which is discretionary, and which the board will not release while a complaint is open. He'd known that. He had done that particular piece of arithmetic at 2 a.m. with a spreadsheet he'd built years ago for exactly this kind of night. The quarterly bonus was not a bonus in any meaningful sense. It was tuition. Lily's spring term at Ridgeway was due Friday, the same Friday. And he had spent 2 years and one very humiliating interview getting her a place there, and the seat did not hold. He walked out at 11 with a laptop bag and a badge that no longer opened anything. Nobody looked at him in the elevator, which was its own kind of message. At home, he did what he always did when the ground moved, which was build a schedule. 5 days written down the side of a legal pad. And the honest answer under most of them was nothing, because the one thing he was categorically forbidden to do was contact anyone connected to the review. He called Nora Callahan down the hall and rearranged the afternoons, and Nora, who had watched Lily on emergency notice more times than either of them counted, asked no questions except whether he'd eaten. Michelle called Monday night, and he let it go to voicemail. He listened to it twice, deleted it, and did not call back. And that was the first genuinely difficult thing he did that week. Michelle spent that week doing something entirely different. She had looked at the photograph maybe 40 times before it broke open for her. And when it did, she was standing in her kitchen at 6 on Monday morning, with the picture blown up on her tablet. The frame showed Joshua's face in the rearview mirror, clean-centered, unobstructed. She had sat in that back seat. She knew the geometry of that car. From the sidewalk across Ontario, through the passenger glass at that hour. With that angle of light. You could not get a clean shot of the driver's mirror. You'd get the pillar, or the seat back, or your own reflection. The only place in the world that photograph could have been taken from was inside the car. She called Evelyn Pierce at 6:15, and Evelyn told her to stop touching the file and send the original. And by that afternoon, a forensic technician had confirmed what Michelle already knew. The image had been captured by a device with a fixed wide-angle lens, and the metadata was consistent with a unit mounted on a windshield. The car was company property. Company property went through a service contract, and service contracts generated records. Every visit, every technician, every authorization signature, filed and retained, because a fleet is an insurance liability, and insurance liabilities are documented obsessively. Michelle requested the maintenance history Tuesday morning and had it by Tuesday afternoon, and there was one entry that did not belong. A cabin electronics inspection, 11 days before the divorce hearing, at a facility the company had never used, authorized under a purchase order, signed by a name she recognized because she had spent 11 years watching that signature go onto checks and cards and one mortgage. She sat with it a long time. Not because she was surprised she'd stopped being surprised by Daniel some years ago, but because of what it meant. He had not decided to attack her after the divorce. He had decided 11 days before it. Every reasonable negotiation over the settlement. Every time he'd told Evelyn he only wanted what was fair, all of it had been running on top of a camera he had already installed. Daniel Reeve held his press conference Wednesday afternoon on the steps of a building he had no connection to, which was a detail Joshua noticed and could not stop noticing. He watched it on his phone at the kitchen counter with the sound low. Daniel was good. That was the thing. He didn't rage, didn't accuse, didn't produce the photograph. He stood there looking like a man who had been quietly wounded and had decided reluctantly to speak. He said he'd spent 11 years supporting his wife's career. He said he had recently learned things that troubled him. He said his only concern now was governance and shareholders and the fiduciary standards of a company his family had held stock in for 2 generations. And then, near the end, he did the thing Joshua had not seen coming. "I want to be careful here," Daniel said, "because there's a child involved. Mr. Bennett is a single father, and I understand the pressures. I understand what a man in that position might feel he has to do to keep his position secure. I don't blame him for it. I blame the person with the power in that room." It was the cleanest piece of work Joshua had ever seen a man do with his mouth. In 2 seconds, Daniel had turned Lily into evidence, made Joshua's entire life look like a strategy, and cast himself as generous for saying it. Joshua set the phone face down and stood there, while the refrigerator hummed. Then he picked it up again, opened the folder he'd created 6 days earlier, and logged the time of the broadcast. 2:18. Because that was what he did. Because somewhere at the bottom of the fear was a very old instinct that said, write it down, all of it. Lily came home from school an hour later and asked why a girl in her class had said her dad was in the newspaper. Joshua was cutting an apple. He kept cutting it. He'd rehearsed several versions of this, and none of them survived contact with her actual face. "Because some grown-ups had a disagreement at my work," he said, "and one of them said things about me that aren't true. Are you going to say true things back? I'm working on it." Lily considered the apple slices. "Bryn's dad says if someone lies about you, you have to be louder." "Bryn's dad might be right," Joshua said, and did not say the rest of it. Which was that being louder was the one thing he could not afford, because volume attracts attention, and attention lands on children. 90 minutes after Daniel finished speaking, Michelle did the thing that made her in the end very difficult to beat. She could have gone to the board with the maintenance record. That was the obvious move, and it was the wrong one, because a hearing convened by Daniel Reeve would be a hearing on Daniel Reeve's terms, and any evidence she produced inside it would look like a chief executive defending herself. She needed the room to belong to her, before she walked into it. So late Wednesday afternoon, she sent a letter of her own to Walter Grady, chairman of the board. In it, that, she voluntarily suspended her own executive authority, effective immediately pending the outcome of Friday's review. She requested that the hearing be opened to full documentary examination rather than closed argument, and that an independent auditor examine any evidence submitted by any party, including her own. She named one, Grant Whitfield, who had no relationship with the company and a reputation for being unpleasant to everybody equally. Grady called her 20 minutes later and asked if she understood what she'd just done. Michelle said she did. What she had done was take away every weapon Daniel had. He could no longer claim she was using her position to bury the complaint because she'd set the position down herself. He could no longer stage the ambush because there was nothing left to ambush. And he had walked into a room where every document submitted would be examined by a man whose entire professional identity was built on finding the seam in a file. Which is fine if your evidence is real and fatal. If it isn't. Joshua learned about it that night from Michelle on the fire escape landing outside her building because he would not go inside and she would not let him leave. He'd broken his own rule to come. Nora had Lily until 9, and he had driven across town telling himself the entire way that he was going to say one thing and then go home. Michelle came down in a coat over whatever she'd been wearing all day and sat on the top step, and for a while, neither of them tried to make it into a conversation. "You suspended yourself," Joshua finally said. It was the only way to make Friday mean something. She pulled the coat tighter. "Whitfield will tear apart whatever Daniel brings. He'll also tear apart whatever I bring. I decided that was acceptable. And if the board sides with him anyway, then I lose the company my father built, and I lose it in front of everyone." She said it the way she said numbers in a meeting. "I've made peace with that. What I haven't made peace with is what he did on those steps this afternoon." Joshua looked out at the alley. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. "I used my daughter as a character reference against me," he said, "in front of the entire state. She asked me about it today. Someone at school told her." He heard his own voice go strange and flattened it back down. "Michelle, I need you to understand something because I don't think you can, and it's not your fault. When this is over, you'll still be Michelle Voss. You'll be the woman who survived it. But there's no version of surviving this for me. There's only the version where my kid grows up with it attached to her name, and she didn't get a vote." Michelle turned toward him, and the light from the window put half her face in it. "So say it. The whole thing. Not the version you've been editing since Thursday." He hadn't planned to. That was the honest truth he'd driven over with one sentence prepared, and he could feel it dissolving. "I've been in love with you since Singapore," Joshua said. "Not the hotel. The morning after when you walked into that room at 8 o'clock and closed the deal like the night before hadn't happened. And I understood I was watching someone decide to be all right. I've known it for 2 years. I never once considered doing anything about it, and not because of the job." "Then why?" "Because I've been the man whose child got put in the middle of an adult mess before. She was 18 months old, and she doesn't remember it. And I remember all of it." He turned his hands over and looked at them. "I made her a promise in the parking lot outside a family court building. That she would never be the collateral in something 2 grown people did to each other. Everything I've built since then is that promise. And last Thursday, you asked me a question in a mirror, and I've spent 6 days finding out that the answer costs exactly 1 promise." Michelle didn't reach for him. He was aware distantly that she wanted to, and had decided not to, and that this was somehow worse. "I didn't know," she said. "When I asked you, I thought the cost was your job. I thought, and I'm ashamed of this, I thought I could just find you a better one. I know you did. It wasn't a job. Her voice went very quiet. "It was her whole life, and I asked you for it in a parking lane because I'd had a good afternoon." She stood, and Joshua stood too, because that was the reflex of 3 years, and for a moment they were closer than they had ever been. "Go home to your daughter," Michelle said. "Whatever happens Friday, you were never the one who should have had to pay for it." He drove home under the speed limit. At the light on Wabash, he reached up and logged the time out of habit, then stopped and looked at what he'd written and felt the first cold edge of a decision he wasn't ready to name. Thursday morning, he called Diane Foster and told her he was withdrawing his response to the complaint and resigning his position effective immediately, and that he would not be attending Friday's hearing. He asked that his letter be entered into the record so the board would understand the matter concerned Michelle Voss alone. Diane asked if he was certain. Joshua said he was. Then he called Michelle and did the harder half. "You're taking yourself out of it," she said, "so they have nothing to hold against me." "I'm taking myself out of it so my daughter has a father with a boring name." He kept his voice level. "Don't call the apartment. Don't send anything. When they ask you Friday, tell them I was an employee and nothing else, and let it be true, because I made it true." "Joshua." "You'll win," he said, and hung up before she could make it worse. By Thursday afternoon, it was done. No job, no hearing, no bonus, which meant no tuition, which meant a phone call to Ridgeway he had not yet been able to make, and no Michelle cut off cleanly by his own hand, which he told himself was the least painful of the four. He sat in the kitchen that night with the legal pad in front of him. 5 days written down the side, and every one of them crossed out, and understood that he had just spent his entire life's savings of self-respect buying something he wasn't sure he'd wanted. Lily came out of her room past 9 because she couldn't sleep, and found her father sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a legal pad in front of him, and nothing on it that hadn't been crossed out. She climbed onto the chair beside him without asking the way she did, and looked at the paper for a while. "Did you say the true things?" she asked. "I decided not to." "Why?" Joshua turned the pad face down. "Because sometimes when you argue with someone loud, they get louder, and the noise falls on the people standing next to you, and you're standing next to me." Lily thought about it with the total seriousness of a 6-year-old handed an adult problem. So the lying person just gets to keep the lie. Sometimes that's the price of being left alone. That's not fair. "No," Joshua said. "It isn't." She got down off the chair, and at the doorway, she turned around. And what she said next, she said without any particular weight, because she didn't know she was saying anything at all. "When someone lies about me at school, I'm going to do what you do. Be quiet and go away." Then she went to bed. Joshua sat at that table a long time after her door closed. He had spent 4.5 years building a life around a single promise, and he'd been so certain of what that promise required that he had never once turned it over and looked at the other side. He thought he was protecting her. What he had actually done tonight in front of her was teach her that decent people are the ones who eat it in silence, that when the world tells a lie about you, the correct response is to disappear, so the lie has room to sit down. That wasn't a promise. That was a lesson, and it was the wrong one. He got up, opened the laptop, and went into the folder he'd created 8 days earlier and never known what to put in. Then he opened the other folders. All of them. 3 years of a professional life, kept the way a man keeps things when he has once stood in a courtroom with nothing in his hands. Calendars, flight confirmations, hotel reservations, the monthly badge exports from building services, every entry and exit with his number and a timestamp on it, receipts including one for a meal delivered to a conference room, on the night of the Brennan Mills receivership, ordered at 8:52 and paid on his own card because the corporate account had closed for the evening. At 2 in the morning, he pulled up the schedule Martin Rusk had read into the record. It was a public filing. Michelle had sent it to him days ago without comment, and he had never opened it. He opened it now and started matching. The board convened at 9 o'clock Friday morning in the room on the 22nd floor with the long table and the bad art. Walter Grady sat at the head. Grant Whitfield sat at the far end with 2 boxes at his feet, and the expression of a man who had already decided to enjoy nothing about his day. Michelle sat on one side with Evelyn Pierce. Daniel Reeve sat on the other with Martin Rusk, and Daniel looked, Joshua would think later, like a man who had already won and was being polite about the interval. Joshua walked in at 9:14. He had no badge. Security had let him as far as the lobby and no farther, and it had taken Diane Foster coming down herself and making a decision she was not authorized to make. He was in violation of the suspension order and of the resignation he'd submitted 24 hours earlier, and of every instinct that had governed him for 4.5 years. Grady stopped mid-sentence. Rusk was on his feet, immediately objecting to the presence of a party who had withdrawn from the proceeding. Whitfield said, without looking up, that he had been engaged to examine documents and would be examining any that entered the room, and that if counsel wished to argue about the door, he could do it afterward. "Mr. Bennett," Grady said, "you resigned yesterday." "I did," Joshua said. "I'd like to be heard anyway, and then you can throw me out." He set a folder on the table. Not a briefcase, not a stack one folder. "I want to start by admitting the thing everyone in this room is waiting to hear. I'm in love with Michelle Voss. I've been in love with her for about 2 years. She didn't know until 8 days ago." He kept his eyes on Grady. "That's the confession. Everything after this is arithmetic." He opened the folder and slid the first document down the table to Whitfield. "That's the schedule Mr. Rusk read into the record at the dissolution hearing. 41 dates over 3 years entered to prove that Ms. Voss abandoned her marriage for her work. It's a public filing, and I'm not disputing a single entry on it. The second document went after it. That's my building access history. Badge 4173 exported monthly by Building Services, which I don't control and never have. On every one of those 41 nights, I badged in before her and badged out after her." He put a third page down. "That's the food order from the Brennan Mills night. 8:52 personal card, because the corporate account had closed. There are 38 more like it." Rusk started to say something about relevance. Whitfield lifted one hand, about 2 inches off the table, and Rusk stopped. "Mr. Rusk built a case on the idea that those 41 nights prove neglect," Joshua said. "What they prove is that on every one of them, a person was in a room with Michelle Voss, and it was me, and I was there, because it was my job. If this board wants to find that a relationship existed during those 3 years, the only evidence anyone has produced for it is a document Ment Reeves' own attorney submitted, and it shows an assistant doing his work. I'd also like the record to reflect that I have never once been inside her home." Then he took out the photograph. "This was taken 8 days ago in a parking lane on Ontario Street. I want to say clearly that the moment it captured was real. Ms. Voss said something to me that afternoon, and I didn't answer her. And I still hadn't answered her when I resigned yesterday." He set it down. "But look at the frame. My face is in the mirror, centered and clean. I've driven that car for 3 years. From the sidewalk through the passenger glass at 4 in the afternoon, you get the door pillar and your own reflection and nothing else. There is one place in the world this picture could have been taken from." Michelle stood up. She had a single sheet of paper, and she did not raise her voice, and she directed it at Grady rather than at Daniel, which Joshua understood immediately was deliberate. Walter. I've spent this week defending myself with the only thing that actually settles anything, which is paperwork. She handed the page to Whitfield, rather than to the chairman. That's the maintenance history on the vehicle. It's fleet property. It's an insurance liability, and every service event on it is recorded. There's a cabin electronics inspection 11 days before my divorce hearing at a facility. This company has never contracted with, authored under a purchase order signed by Daniel Reeve. The room went very quiet. Forensics confirmed the image came from a fixed wide-angle lens on a windshield mount, Michelle said. So there are two facts in front of you, and I'd like them in the right order. Fact 1. A device was installed in a company vehicle without authorization. Fact 2. The installation happened 11 days before my marriage legally ended, which means that at the time Mr. Reeve was telling my attorney he only wanted what was fair. The camera was already there. Daniel didn't move. Rusk leaned toward him and said something, and Daniel didn't respond to that either, and Joshua watched a man arrive in real time, at the understanding that he had brought a photograph into a room with an auditor in it. Whitfield spoke at length for the first time. He said the metadata on the submitted image was inconsistent with the account of its capture given in the complaint. He said the purchase order carried a signature and a vendor with no history in the company's accounts payable system. He said that in his professional opinion, the evidentiary package supporting the complaint had been misrepresented as to origin, and that this was a matter for counsel rather than for a board. Grady asked Joshua if he had anything further. He did, and it was the only part he hadn't planned. I want to explain why those records exist, because I don't want anyone thinking I built a case against my employer for 3 years. He looked at the folder. 4.5 years ago, I stood in a family court, and a woman said under oath that I was never home. I had been home almost every night, and I could not produce one piece of paper that said so. I won that hearing by about an inch, and I walked out and started writing everything down. And I've never stopped, and everybody here has made a joke about it at some point. Nobody in the room made a sound. I did it because I never again wanted to argue for my own life with nothing in my hands. Everything I've done for Michelle Voss for 3 years. The flights, the food that showed up at midnight, the hotel corridor in Singapore. I'm not going to describe I did as a man who understands exactly what quiet decency is worth, because I'm raising a daughter, and I want her to see one adult do it. His voice didn't rise. On Wednesday, Reeve used my child to make me look like a man working an angle. Yesterday I resigned so she'd be left alone. Last night she told me that when someone lies about her at school, she'll do what I do. Be quiet and go away. He closed the folder. So I came in here, not for the job. I already gave the job up and I'm not asking for it back. I came because that's not what I want her to learn from me. The board deliberated for 50 minutes. They dismissed the complaint in full. They restored Michelle Voss to her executive authority and entered a finding that no evidence of improper conduct had been established. And they referred the matter of the submitted photograph, the unauthorized device, and the purchase order to outside counsel with a recommendation to the state's attorney. By the following Tuesday, Daniel Reeve was under investigation for fabrication of evidence and unlawful electronic surveillance, and his 12%, the seat he had traded a marriage to buy, was frozen under a compelled transfer review. His own attorney told him he would not win. Diane Foster caught Joshua in the corridor before he reached the elevators. The board had released the withheld quarter with the finding, she said, and it would clear that afternoon. He stood there and did the only calculation that had mattered all week, and it came out with about 4 hours to spare, and he had to look at the carpet for a moment before he could thank her. Michelle found him by the elevators after that. and she didn't say anything at all. She walked into him and put her arms around his neck and stayed there, and Joshua stood in the hallway of a building he no longer worked in and held on to her while people walked past, pretending not to look. "I answered your question," he said eventually. "In there, in front of 11 people and an auditor." "You did? That wasn't how I wanted to do it." Michelle pulled back far enough to look at him. Her eyes were red, and she was doing nothing about it, which he had never seen in 3 years. "Joshua, I want to meet your daughter." She said it carefully, like a proposal she'd already had rejected once in her head. "Not as her father's boss. I'm not that anymore anyway. As somebody who's going to be in her life if she'll have me. And if she won't, I'll wait until she will. She's 6. Her only requirement is that you take her seriously. That," Michelle said, "I can do." 8 months later, on a Saturday evening in November, they were at a restaurant on Halstead with a table for 3. Michelle was still running the company, and running it harder than before. The year had done something to her that showed up mostly in board meetings where people had learned not to test her. Joshua wasn't her assistant anymore. He'd taken the severance and put it into a small consultancy that handled operational work for 2 clients and would probably never handle more than 4. And he was home by 5:15 every day, which was the entire point of it. Lily had finished the spring term at Ridgeway and started the fall one, and nobody at that school had said a word about a newspaper since March. She sat between them now, with her feet not touching the floor. Working through a stack of paper napkins, she was folding into what she insisted were boats. The waiter came. Michelle ordered for the table without looking at the menu. The pasta with the butter sauce and no green things, visible side of applesauce. Extra napkins, and Lily's head came up fast. "You didn't ask me." "I didn't need to ask you," Michelle said. Lily absorbed this, then broke into a grin, so pleased with itself that she had to hide it behind a napkin boat, and started giggling and couldn't stop for almost a minute. Over her head, Michelle looked at Joshua. He knew what she was going to say before she said it, the way he'd known things about her for 3 years, except that now he was allowed to. "I keep thinking about what you told them, that you wanted her to see one adult do it." Michelle reached over and straightened the collar of Lily's dress without breaking eye contact with him. "I don't want her to just see it, Joshua. I want to build a life where it's the normal thing in the house." "Then let's build it," he said. "Together." Michelle smiled. "All 3 of us." Lily wanted to know what they were talking about, and neither of them told her, and she went back to her boats. Some families start with a wedding. This one started with a man who wrote down the time at a red light, and a woman who finally read her own calendar and saw who had been standing in it. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us. Tell us the moment that got you and subscribe, because there are more like this one coming.